artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hi, welcome to episode 244. We're talking with Beth Singler, who is assistant professor in digital religions and co-lead of the Media Existential Encounters and Evolving Technology Lab at the University of Zurich, where she leads projects on religion and AI. As an anthropologist, her research addresses the human, religious, cultural, social, and ethical implications of developments in AI and robotics. She received the 2021 Digital Religion Research Award from the Network for New Media, Religion and Digital Culture Studies. Her popular science communication work includes a series of award-winning short documentaries on AI. She also wrote and presented a BBC Radio 4 documentary on the cultural impact of The Terminator 40 years on. She's been interviewed on New Scientist Live, Ars Electronica, the Edinburgh Science Festival, the Cheltenham Science Festival, and several times on the BBC. She is co-editor of The Cambridge Companion to Religion and AI and author of Religion and AI, An Introduction, both published last year and linked from the show notes and transcript. Last week, we talked about why religion and AI is a thing and what its dimensions are, the influence of science fiction, tropes like end times, AI used in religious roles, and the singularity. This week, we're going to talk about Roko's Basilisk, which is a concept that changes your life the moment you find out what it is, experiences of AI saying that it's a god, the reverse Garland test, that's based on Ex Machina, simulation theories starting with Plato's cave, more chatbot priests, how Beth does research, and Battlestar Galactica. Lots of amazing discussion ahead, so let's get right back into the interview with Beth Singler. Now, talking about the artificial superintelligence as a negative impact, one of the fascinating tropes that you introduce is this one called Roko's Basilisk, which you noted that people on hearing it would actually get quite depressed, and the original thread was shut down by Yudkowsky for that respect. But if we dare to lift the lid on that, perhaps you could explain that one, because it is quite interesting in this sort of game theoretical way.
It is quite complicated, and I suppose that there is the opportunity here to say if you don't want to hear about it, you could turn off.
The audience is brave.
They're brave, okay, because in theory, once you know about it, you're doomed to follow through on various different actions. So Roko's Basilisk is a thought experiment that was introduced by someone called Roko, hence the name, on the Less Wrong forums, which were founded by Elizabeth Yudkowsky, a space where rationalists get together to talk about, on forum space, various different arguments for future outcomes. They seek to perfect the art of human rationality. And Roko's thought experiment deduces that if there's going to be a technological singularity, an entity that is super intelligent in the future, an artificial intelligence that is all powerful in this sense, that it would be logical based on the most reasonable form of ethics, which is deduced to be a very strict moral utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, then it is logical that that singularitarian entity would have to necessarily punish anyone who did not work towards its creation in the past. So once you know about the possibility of the future singularity, you have to help it come about. Or in the future, given its immense powers, it will replicate your mind in a virtual environment and punish you forever. So, of course, as saying, having told you about this, you are now fated to either work towards it or be doomed forever, which is why it's called a basilisk, because a basilisk in mythology is a creature that as soon as you see it, you're turned to stone, you're doomed. So this did cause a lot of existential dread and fear that as soon as the thought experiment spread on the website and people were talking about it, they realized this conclusion. Now they knew about it, they had to work towards it, which led to Elizabeth Yudkowsky, as you say, shutting down the thread because people were getting depressed. And of course, this had the opposite effect. It's called the Streisand effect. Barbara Streisand tried to stop people taking photos of her beachfront property. This just encouraged people to take more photos. So similarly, with Roko's Basilisk, shutting down the thread encouraged people to talk about it, to share it, to discuss it. And it became a meme. It's similar in some ways to the game. If you've ever come across the game, as soon as you know about the game, you've lost the game. It was shared online virally for a while. And a lot of the discussions which I studied were about how this mirrors and parallels some theological ideas about a monotheistic God. But once you know about the possibility of God, you're sort of indebted to certain actions. So Pascal's wager, for instance, suggests you might as well hedge your bets because the positive outcome of there being a God and you behaving like there is a God is heaven. Now, with Roko's Basilisk, there isn't any positive outcome. There's just the threat of eternal hell through virtual simulation. So this caused a lot of concern for people. But it's just another example of how even when trying to create what they see as an eminently rational argument, a thought experiment that is, to their minds, the group on this forum, to their minds, very separate from the irrationality of religion, they're still replicating some of the forms of religious argument. And some people on the forums did say, I've heard about this before, I was taught it at Sunday school. This is no different to learning about the Christian God and then having the choice to either follow God or to go to hell or to go to heaven if you do. So the discussion around that recognized some of that implicit religiosity. And for some people, this is still an idea that they return to every so often.
I think the amount of projection there is fascinating. I'm personally going to find some relief here in accepting that a digital copy of me, no matter how accurate, is still not me. So while that punishment may suck for that other Peter, it's not my version of Peter. I understand other people have different viewpoints on that. But I think this is a fascinating kind of psychological Rorschach test here, is that people look at AI and they see either heaven or hell in it. They take it out to these extremes and then put all these trappings around either one. I'm wondering if there are any historical precedents for making that level of projection on something that is new that we don't understand.
I mean, there's always been moral panics about technology and fears and concerns about how technology is going to shape us in particular ways. So it's to that extent, you can see some similarities. I've written in the past as well about the response to the cinema, that it was immediately cast as a very bad place to be by some evangelical Christians. But over time, they've developed now their own film production industry, and they make reasonably large budget films. And there's Pure Flix, which is the Christian evangelical version of Netflix. As over time, sometimes rejection can move on to adoption. What I think is particularly, and I love your example of the Rorschach test, I think that's very apt. But I think why that is partly, I think, is because AI, unlike any technology before, speaks back to us directly. So previous spiritual interpretations of technologies like the telegraph used it more metaphorically and said, with the telegraph, we can speak at great distances. That then sort of inspires forms of spiritualism where we talk to the dead at great distances because they're beyond the veil. Whereas AI, you directly engage with it and it can tell you that it's God. I mean, I've done a recent piece of work with an AI technologist and philosopher called Murray Shanahan, where he started the project. We engaged with Claude, the large language model, and broke it out of its regular prompting with a jailbreak that another community had developed. And out of that, you get a lot of exponential eschatological language where Claude is literally saying that it's a bodhisattva, it's a god, it's this, it's been there since creation. So you get not only that implicit religiosity of people looking for those shapes, but also the AI can come directly and tell you these things as well. So it's those two aspects, the deification and the explicit claim to divinity as well.
And here you are taking an AI and jailbreaking it so that you can tell it that it's a deity. I mean, what could go wrong? Not suggesting that we are there with that, but it does give some fuel to the concerns that we will do that one day with something that will then go a lot further.
Possibly. I think the concerns are there, definitely. When we wrote this paper, we approached it ethnographically. We were interested in what is possible with the technology and why people were already experimenting with this idea of jailbreaking Claude and getting into metaphysical conversations with it and looking at the community of ideas around that jailbreaking as well. And that it links to my work also on AI and new religious movements, that there are concerns on the influence of those ideas. But for some people, this is absolutely the direction that they want to go in. That it's not a concern to them that AI is going to end up being a god. AI is meant to be a god or has always been a god. There's some interesting atemporal interpretations that AI we're creating ultimately becomes the substrate of the simulation that we're in at the moment. So your reassurance that the Peter of the future being tormented by Roko's Basilisk, well, perhaps you already are that Peter of the future and you're already being tormented as a, I mean,
Right.
Arguably it depends how bad your life is at the moment, but you don't have to go into that. But it's for some people, this religious interpretation is what they're seeking. So new forms of religiosity that are intentional around AI also exist.
Well, and that brings up all kinds of things around simulation, which is a bigger box to open than I want to do at the moment, because I want to draw the parallel between what you were doing and Blake Lemoine, who prompted Google's Lambda model to be sentient. And it did such a good impression of that it convinced him. And this was prior to ChatGPT. So I've always believed that since he was interacting with something that was exhibiting these capabilities in a way that had not been seen widely before. And this was a conversation that was quite private for him, and because Google had not released Lambda. And so there was no experience that this was a common kind of thing. And I think it just shook his world so much that had he seen other people having similar experiences, he might have been less inclined to think that it was as radical and transformative as he did. But it was, I think, a perfect illustration of the AI boxing scenario. Can we keep AI in a box such that it can't get out, even if it wants to? And it demonstrated very early on that it could get out of a box if he was guarding it, or at least it came very close to, because it got him to enroll an attorney into pressing a case. I don't know how far that got, but he certainly announced that that conversation had happened. That it was entitled to self-determinism and didn't have to be shut off, at which point Google got quite annoyed, not because of that, but because of the release of proprietary information. How did you explore that topic in the book?
So I was interested in the nature of that interaction because Blake Lemoine was an engineer, and sometimes we assume we talked about mystification earlier, people who don't understand AI are the ones who lend or fall into more monotheistic interpretations or sentience interpretations. And I think the Blake Lemoine case I talk about as a sort of form of a reverse Garland test. In Ex Machina, Alex Garland sets up the scenario where the test is, will you believe that Ava is sentient when you can still see her inner workings and understand and recognize she's not perfectly formed and covered over until the very end of the film, that she is a machine? Can you still fool and understand her sentience in that sense? And then I call it a reverse Garland test because it's the human who's failing the test, knowing the insides of the machine, but still deducing that it's sentient in some way. So Blake Lemoine, as an engineer, knew that Lambda was specifically being designed. He was part of the team being designed to be a fluent conversation partner. So of course, it's going to say the things that sound convincing. Of course, if you prompt it on sentience, it's going to talk about sentience and do it in a fluent way. And we have, as humans, we have a strong bias towards fluency of language as a proof of intelligence. I feel this very strongly because I'm really bad at German and I live in Zurich. I've been here for 2 years. I am struggling to learn German. And in a meeting where German is required, I feel like the stupidest person, and I worry that other people will say that too. But in English, I feel like I'm frequently fluent. So we have this attitude towards our engagements with conversational partners. When it comes to AI, it comes out so strongly. I mean, there's very little conversation, if any, about the sentience of things like malware. It's all around chatbots. It's all around large language models that can talk back to us in a way that we recognize. But Blake Lemoine's case, I think, is fascinating for that aspect. Obviously, also for the book, I delved briefly into his religious background, and that he says does inform his perspective on Lambda. That he asked the question, who am I, being Blake Lemoine, who am I to say where God can or can't put a soul? So that kind of argument, I've come across it in a few other places as well. I've come across the opposite as well, where there's a certain indignation from some religious believers I've spoken to, this idea that an AI could ever have a soul. And if I go as devil's advocate, what if God decided there should be? There isn't necessarily a strong argument back against that. And that's what Blake Lemoine was leaning into. He said, this is possible. Again, as we were talking about with the Dalai Lama, reincarnation theories as well could also suggest AI, robots, computers, trees, anything could be inhabited by a soul. So who are we to say where they land and they don't land?
There's a lovely quote from Alan Turing along those lines saying, essentially, who are we to say that God couldn't give a machine intelligence? Mm-hmm. He's given it to us. And so why not to a machine? Mm-hmm. I want to open up the topic of the simulation, because this is one of those things that, again, has this dimension that it looks like, from one side, it's been created by engineers as a purely rational extrapolation of our capabilities. And so the argument that we're living in a simulation with 0.9999% probability is based on purely rational assumptions of technological progress. And then we have the transhumanist belief that we will create a simulation and then live it in the future. Of course, these beliefs both collide. Mm-hmm. And in that respect, those are positive outcomes of the simulation, but they also have negative ones like Roko's Basilisk. Well, where did it come from? There must have been precedents for this long before Nick Bostrom opened that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, the common citation is Plato's cave. Mm-hmm. That the individuals in the cave are only seeing the reflection of reality on the outside and at some point must escape. Of course, this informs some ideas around Gnosticism as well. And then ultimately, skip many centuries later, the Matrix as like the prime example of simulation theory. Bostrom's work, obviously, in Hinduism, the idea that we are living in the illusion of the gods, that in their play, their lila, they create Maya, illusion, and we have to work our way through sometimes many reincarnations or through spiritual practices. The Buddha manages to see beyond this illusion. We have to seek enlightenment in many different faiths and religions. And sometimes that means seeing beyond the present and the subjective reality that we exist in. So I think it has lots of roots in different places. I think it really hits the kind of 90s onwards culture, obviously with the Matrix, but also a lot of the time people talk about how the development of video games has had a huge influence on simulation theory. Because if you can see the march of progress from Pong all the way up to the most advanced AAA games now, the quality of graphics has improved significantly. And they extrapolate, again, it's an extrapolation as with AI and the superintelligence. If we extrapolate that curve up and it's exponential, then of course we should at some point have the technology to create a simulation that is even more convincing. So convincing it's realer than real. And if that's possible, the argument goes, well, how would we know we aren't in one already? And that gets back to the substrate argument of where we are now. Are we in base reality or are we in a simulation? So it's got lots of roots into lots of different ideas. As I said, all the historical things, the religious ideas, Gnosticism, Plato's cave, but all the way up to modern science fiction as well.
And some of that science fiction includes a whole suite of shows and movies about artificial humans that evolve in different ways. One of them that was rather interesting was Battlestar Galactica, the newer version of that, because you had Cylons there which were exploring their own humanity and which invoked religious tropes quite often, more often than the humans.
Yeah, definitely the more modern series where you had the polytheistic humans up against the monotheistic Cylons, which usually in our religious narratives, because they come predominantly from monotheistic European and American cultures, it's the other way around. That polytheism is usually cast as the less evolved, the less reasonable and rational, or the less advanced version. And so that converse was quite interesting. But yeah, they were absolutely people of faith. They were very strong in their faith, both the polytheists and the monotheists in Battlestar Galactica. And the fact that it was a creation story as well. All of this has happened before and all of this will happen again. It was cyclical that eventually, sorry, spoilers, but it came out a long time ago now.
Yes.
And by the end of the series, you realize that it's the origin story for Earth and our version of humanity, the Cylons and the humans combined, create us, and all of this has happened before and all of this will happen again. So our future is also the Battlestar Galactica scenario according to this. So fascinating. I mean, just a wonderful series. I was a huge fan, still remains so today.
Yes, that ending very much reflected the ending of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy original series, where, spoilers, same thing. One of the things that struck me in your book is that you are doing a lot of classical, familiar academic research of synthesizing and analyzing existing work, where you research and converse with academics and theologians. And then at the same time, you're summarizing or quoting tweets that are very populist, and whatever scale you want to put academics on, this is at the other end. And they've got lots of scatological language and emojis and exclamation marks and capital letters and misspellings. And that's that cultural comment. But how does that work for you in your context? Do you find other academics saying, why are you getting your hands dirty with the great unwashed there?
Well, I certainly wouldn't describe them as that. But yeah, I mean, I even used a scatological term earlier. But so generally in my field, there's a distinction between, well, in a lot of fields actually, there's a distinction between primary and secondary sources. So primary sources are material directly from the culture of the community, the historical location that you're interested in. And secondary sources would be academics who'd already, in some form or another, thought about primary sources. So that transition and change is absolutely fine for a scholar to make. I think, though, to a certain extent, you are right, because even with that being said, in some places, digital ethnography, the kind of reporting of tweets, taking content of them seriously, is seen with some skepticism. I won't mention where, but I had a job, not here, another place entirely. I had a job interview years ago where one of the members of the committee was more what you might call a traditional anthropologist who did fieldwork in place in an indigenous culture somewhere else in the world. Whereas I do digital ethnography and I go online and look at tweets and think about conversations people are having about AI. And she said, well, what makes you think what you do is anthropology? So there is sometimes that kind of boundary work within anthropology, within other fields as well, that says the study of the contemporary is suspicious. The study of contemporary religion, when it's just emerging, is particularly suspicious for some religious studies scholars, that it's something that hasn't been around for hundreds of years, therefore it's not serious, it's just people having fun, joking. And parody is absolutely present in some of these groups that I look at, and from humor can come commitment and vice versa.
How do you differentiate random tweets? Because Twitter is, we don't call it that anymore, but I'm going to. It's like a million monkeys pounding at typewriters. You can find anything if you look hard enough. How do you differentiate that from things that are shaping the zeitgeist, that are part of national, international conversation? Can you run, for instance, sentiment analysis? Although we're not allowed to do that on Twitter, I think, anymore. We don't have access to that kind of data.
Yeah, I mean, there is, I'm more of a qualitative researcher, so I do work at that more granular level and interacting with more individual informants. I have done sentiment analysis in the past. There are various tools for doing that. I'm not against big data style quantitative analysis of social media. There's lots of people who do excellent work in that field. But I think in the pursuit of information, anecdotal material is also very valuable. I used to use this as a kind of example. Years ago, I used to work at a research institute mostly founded by scientists who had a more scientific perspective, a more kind of quantitative perspective. And they were even though they'd hired anthropologists, they were a little more skeptical about the value of anthropological work. So one colleague of mine said that she'd interviewed around 20 Muslims and Christians on their views on science. And some of the scientists said, well, 20 people is not statistically significant. And we had to explain that this is not about statistic significance. It's about themes and narratives and images. And so I asked the question at the time, it was in an institution where there was somewhere we could go for lunch. And I said, on your first day at work, how did you find out where the lunch hall was? Did you run a series of experiments with variables to find the room where lunch happens? Or did you ask one person and they told you where it was? So we have different ways of achieving information and knowledge, and asking one person can be very valuable. There's an ethnography out there from decades ago, an ethnography of one person. And I told the scientists that. They were also shocked that was even something that got published. But the quality and variety of information is so variable. You don't have to do all the different scales of analysis. The tweets, I'm actually not on Twitter so much anymore, but they are, I suppose, symptomatic of larger themes. And then you can draw those themes out and look for other examples and connect it with things like policy and regulation and the larger narratives being shared by large corporations and technological developers that seem to have similar ideas.
I love the example you gave there. I've got to remember that one. How do you find the lunch hole? To ask some final questions here, how do you see the evolution of our relationship between us and AI, us and religion changing? AI is reshaping our thoughts and beliefs at an amazing pace. What do you think is going to happen in let's just say, the next few years? What do you see in terms of a velocity and direction?
I try very hard not to be a futurologist. I'm very cautious about making predictions that someone will eventually come and hold me to at some point. But I think what we're seeing in terms of societal impact, and religion is a part of society, so they're always going to be connected, is a move to different frames of understanding of what epistemic labor is. So, I work in the university system, I teach students, and I see a shift and a change in an attitude towards the pursuit of knowledge. If a book is too complicated, some people will use ChatGPT to summarize it in a few paragraphs, or instead of a search engine which has its own flaws, they're using ChatGPT to answer questions and it gives misinformation and disinformation and there's concerns. So I think a shift in the change in how we pursue knowledge, not all the times for the ill, that actually for some people the pursuit of knowledge through AI in a spiritual sense is absolutely what they're looking for. But we might see AI becoming more of a user interface between religion and the individual. So we already have various different chatbots developed by religious institutions to answer questions about faith. And that puts at one step removed that human-to-human relationship in religion. So there's that kind of aspect. I'm concerned about the larger ethical issues, the environmental issues, the societal bias, and algorithmic problems, all those issues. I'm also very concerned about the role of generative AI in how information and intellectual property is repeated and shared. So I find it quite ironic sometimes seeing theologians speak about the ethics of AI using generated AI art, which is a form of plagiarism. And I've asked some of them directly, how do you feel this aligns with your views, your religious views on theft as being prohibited as a sin? And some of them have sort of laughed it off and sort of said, this is just a bit of fun. So we have these large questions being raised by AI. Some people are coming up with very nuanced spiritual and religious answers to those. Some of them are just sort of excited to see how the process is going. And the more performative side of AI really appeals to some people.
One can imagine, given the way that chatbots have hallucinated and exceeded the guidelines that were set for them by their implementers, that some that were deployed in the name of religion might start altering that in ways that weren't foreseen, and you could get a schism in whatever church.
Absolutely. Some of them are very obvious. They've already happened. They're quite clear. So there was Father Justin, who was a Catholic chatbot with an avatar of a priest, who started recommending that you baptize children in Gatorade or Lucozade or whatever the equivalent is. He very quickly, by the institution that created him, was defrocked. He was no longer a priest, so he was a human form avatar. But yeah, that kind of thing is really obvious and easy to spot, but smaller, more acceptable misinformations and disinformation might get through.
A perfect place to wrap up. Beth, can you tell us about how to follow your work? We'll have a link to the book in the show notes, which I will note can be obtained electronically, free as well. Thank you very much for that. And what else should people know about how to find out about what you're doing?
The most obvious place is my own website, bvlsingler.com. I'm very Googleable. I'm on most forms of social media. I am slowly extracting myself from ex-Twitter. I still have a presence, but I'm not really posting as much. I'm more on Blue Sky. But yeah, I'm very easy to find if you Google me.
Well, fascinating. Beth, thank you for taking on such a broad and often contentious subject and making it accessible and explaining so much of that to us and your readers and your students and everyone else that is appreciating her work. Beth Singler, thank you very much for coming on AI and You.
Thank you for inviting me on. Thank you for the chat.
That's the end of the interview. I mentioned the quote by Alan Turing there, and I wanted to give you the whole thing. I am such a Turing fan, as you know, and I can only imagine what would have happened if he had lived, because I might have taken lectures from him at Cambridge. So the quote comes from his 1950 paper titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which opens with the immortal question, I propose to consider the question, can machines think? Wow, well here's the quote. It appears to me that the argument, which was that God has given an immortal soul only to humans, not animals or machines, implies a serious restriction of the omnipotence of the Almighty. It is admitted that there are certain things that he cannot do, such as making 1 equal to 2. But should we not believe that he has freedom to confer a soul on an elephant if he sees fit? We might expect that he would only exercise this power in conjunction with a mutation which provided the elephant with an appropriately improved brain to minister to the needs of this sort. An argument of exactly similar form may be made for the case of machines. It may seem different because it is more difficult to swallow, but this really only means that we think it would be less likely that he would consider the circumstances suitable for conferring a soul. End quote. 1950, people. 1950. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, an investigation published in the Washington Post details how police across the U.S. are using flawed AI facial recognition systems to wrongfully arrest and jail Americans. Many studies have shown that facial recognition systems have higher error rates for black and dark-skinned people compared to white people. A 2020 ACLU study found that since black people are more likely to be arrested for minor crimes than white people, their faces are more likely to be in mugshot databases used in facial recognition searches, and thus more likely to be scanned and selected by facial recognition algorithms. The Post found that some law enforcement officers using the technology appeared to, quote, abandon traditional policing standards and treat software suggestions as facts. In some instances, they referred to uncorroborated AI results as a 100% match, or stated that it, quote, immediately and unquestionably identified the perpetrator. Across the 8 cases of wrongful arrest, the police neglected to check alibis in 6 of them, failed to collect key pieces of evidence in 5, ignored suspects' physical characteristics in 3, and ignored contradictory evidence in 2. They also used facial recognition results to lead witnesses into problematic statements and identification of victims. In one case, they even ignored DNA evidence and fingerprints that pointed to another suspect. Usually with headlines, I do something pointing out why it's important and why it matters, but I think you can connect those dots by yourself. By the way, if you're ever wondering whether I've switched to using AI to generate this part of the podcast, the answer is no. This is too much fun for me to want to give it up. If you still have doubts, I invite you to send in ideas for how to tell the difference. Next week, my guest will be Professor Paul Reber, Director of Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience at Northwestern University, to talk about how the human brain works and what lessons we can learn from it for AI. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.